What would you do if the only thing you could afford was a memory everyone else had tried to forget? What if you traded your last dollars not for a home, but for a ruin, a pile of stones that the world had already dismissed as worthless? They said she was a fool, trading good money for bad ground. But the truth waiting inside those crumbling walls was a secret the entire valley had forgotten how to hear. Stay close now, and find a quiet place to settle in. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight, as we tell the story of Ilara Vance and the forgotten ruin on Whisperwind Ridge. Ilara Vance arrived in the town of Redemption Creek with little more than the dust on her coat and a silence that had settled deep in her bones. The wagon she drove was borrowed, the sway-backed mule pulling it was her own, and the grief she carried was a private, heavy stone. It had been 10 years since she'd left this valley, a bride following her husband, Caleb, toward a promise of richer soil in the west. Now she was back, a widow. The rich soil had taken him, claimed by a fever that burned through their small homestead like a prairie fire, leaving nothing but ash and memory. She had sold what little was left, enough for a train ticket east and the purchase of the old mule, Gideon, who seemed to carry a weariness that matched her own. The town hadn't changed. The main street was still a river of dust, flanked by the same false-fronted buildings. The mercantile, the saloon, the land office, the smithy. Faces turned as her wagon creaked past. She saw whispers form on lips that had once wished her well. They saw the tired mule, the worn dress, the absence of the smiling man who had ridden out with her. They saw failure. Ilara kept her eyes fixed forward on the raw blue line of the mountains that cradled the valley. That was the only thing that felt like coming home. Her family was long gone, buried in the small churchyard on the edge of town, leaving her with no anchor but the land itself. Her only stop was to see Jedediah Croft, an old friend of her father's who ran the livery. He was a man made of leather and kindness, his face a map of long years under a hard sun. He took Gideon's reins without a word, his eyes holding a gentle sorrow that needed no explanation. "Heard you were coming back, Ilara," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Heard about Caleb. I'm sorry for it." She just nodded, unable to form the words. The knot in her throat was a constant companion. "You need a place to stay?" he asked, already knowing the answer. "I need a place to own," she replied, her voice rough from disuse. "Something small, something quiet." Jedediah wiped his hands on a rag, his gaze drifting up toward the high ridges that walled in the valley to the north. Not much left that's small or quiet. Silas Blackwoods bought up most everything in the lowlands, consolidating. The name fell like a stone in the dusty air. Blackwood. She remembered him as a boy, loud and boastful, always taking what wasn't his. It seemed some things grew, but never changed. "What about higher up?" she asked. "On the ridges?" Jedediah frowned. "Nothing up there but rock and wind, and the old McCready place, I suppose. Though you can't call it a place anymore, more a pile of stones." He paused. "They call it the Widow's Folly now. Been sitting empty 30 years. No one's wanted it." A memory surfaced, faint and gray, of her father pointing up at a distant chimney stack on the ridge, telling a story about a reclusive old man who talked to plants. A place forgotten. A place no one wanted. It sounded like a mirror of herself. "Is it for sale?" she asked. Jedediah looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the fragile steel beneath the exhaustion. He saw she wasn't looking for comfort. She was looking for a place to make a final stand. "Deeds in the land office. Been there for decades. Sheriff holds it for taxes, costs next to nothing. But Ilara, it's nothing. The ground is thin. The well went dry. The wind'll peel the skin from your bones in winter." "I'll take a look at it," she said, her decision already made. The idea of it, a place of stone and wind, felt right. Soil had betrayed her. It had taken everything. Maybe it was time to build on rock. She thanked Jedediah. Her first real words, spoken with a sliver of newfound purpose. He offered her the use of the wagon for another day, a quiet act of faith in a woman everyone else was ready to write off. As she walked toward the land office, the whispers of the town followed her like ghosts, murmuring about the poor Vance girl, back with nothing, now aiming to buy nothing. She felt their pity and their judgment. But for the first time in months, she also felt the faint, unfamiliar flicker of a path forward, a path leading up, away from the soft, fertile ground that had become her graveyard. The path led to stone. The man in the land office, a clerk with a green visor and ink-stained fingers, peered at her over his spectacles when she stated her purpose. "The McCready place?" he asked, a small, superior smile touching his lips. "Ma'am, are you sure? There's a reason it sat for 30 years. He pulled a dusty ledger from a high shelf, blowing a cloud of neglect from its cover. "Here it is. Lot 74, Whisperwind Ridge. 16 acres, one stone structure, condition, derelict." He ran a finger down the page. "Tax deed. $50. $50 was nearly all she had left in the world. It was the sum total of her failed life in the West, the ghost of 1,000 acres of wheat, of a sturdy farmhouse, of a future. She laid the money on the counter. The worn bills were a testament to her loss. The clerk counted them slowly, as if surprised they were real. He filled out the deed with a flourish, the scratch of his pen loud in the silent room. As he handed her the paper, he couldn't help but add, "Silas Blackwood offered 10 for it last year. Said he'd use the stones for a new wall. You've paid 5 times what it's worth." Elara took the deed, the paper cool and official in her hand. It felt heavier than a simple document. It felt like a wager against the world. She folded it carefully and placed it inside her bodice, the paper resting against her skin like a promise or a prayer. Outside, the sun was bright, making her blink. The town seemed to hold its breath as she walked back toward the livery, the news of her purchase traveling faster than she did. Men standing outside the saloon stopped talking. Women in the mercantile parted the curtains to watch her pass. They saw a woman buying a ghost, a forgotten ruin on a god-forsaken ridge. They saw a fool. What they couldn't see was the flicker of hope in her, the desperate need for a place so broken that no one could hurt her there, a place where the only thing left to do was build. She had her deed. She had her mule. She had a pile of stones waiting for her on a windy ridge. It was, for the first time in a long time, a beginning. What was she thinking? Trading everything for a ruin. Was it desperation, or did some deeper instinct guide her hand? What secret could a pile of forgotten stones possibly hold that an entire valley had overlooked for 30 years? Let us know what you think in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories of hidden treasures and quiet triumphs. Now, with the deed in hand, Elara Vance had to face the reality of what she had just bought. The mockery wasn't long in coming. As Elara loaded a few meager supplies into the wagon at the mercantile, a sack of flour, beans, salt, a new axe head, the whispers were no longer whispers. They were spoken just loud enough for her to hear. $50 for that pile of rocks. One man chuckled to another over a barrel of pickles. She'll be back down before the first snow, begging for a room. The store owner, a man named Henderson, gave her a look of pity as he tallied her bill. "It's a hard place up there, miss," he said, his voice laced with a condescending kindness she found more grating than open scorn. The wind never stops. Elara simply paid her bill, her face a mask of calm she did not feel. Each word was a small stone being thrown at her, and she was already weary from the weight of them. As she was tying the last of her provisions down, a shadow fell over the wagon. She looked up to see Silas Blackwood astride a magnificent black stallion, the leather of his saddle creaking with expensive authority. He was a big man, his face ruddy with sun and self-satisfaction. He looked down at her, his gaze sweeping over her worn dress and the tired mule with open contempt. "Vance," he said, the name a dismissal. "I hear you bought the old McCready rubble." Ilara met his gaze and said nothing. Her silence seemed to irritate him. "I offered the county $10 for that plot," he boomed, for the benefit of anyone listening. "Just for the stone. You paid 50. You know what that tells me?" He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial growl. "It tells me you've got more grief than sense. That ridge is useless. The water's gone, the soil's bare. You'll starve or freeze before spring." He smirked. "When you're ready to admit your mistake, I'll give you $5 for the deed. Save you the trouble of climbing down." He expected a response, a protest, an argument, tears. He got none. Ilara finished checking her knot and turned to Gideon, stroking the mule's coarse neck. The animal let out a long, slow breath, as if mirroring her own forced patience. Blackwood's face tightened. Her refusal to engage him was an insult he couldn't quite grasp. With a sharp tug on his reins, he wheeled the stallion around, kicking up a cloud of dust that settled over her and the wagon. "Have fun with your kingdom of rocks, widow," he called over his shoulder, his laughter echoing down the street. She stood there for a moment, the dust settling in her hair, the laughter ringing in her ears. Her hands were clenched into fists at her sides. It would have been so easy to give in, to feel the shame they all wanted her to feel. Instead, a cold, hard anger began to burn away the fog of her grief. They saw a weak, broken woman. She would have to show them something else. As she prepared to climb onto the wagon seat, a soft voice stopped her. "The stone remembers what the soil forgets." Ilara turned. An old woman sat on a bench in the shade of the land office, her face a beautiful, intricate web of wrinkles. She was wrapped in a dark blanket, though the day was warm. Ilara recognized her as Alma, a native woman who lived alone in the foothills and rarely came to town. Her eyes were dark and clear, and they looked at Ilara not with pity, but with a strange, knowing intensity. "I'm sorry?" Ilara asked, stepping closer. Alma did not repeat herself. She simply gave a slow, deliberate nod toward the high northern ridge. "Some roots don't need water," she said, her voice like the rustle of dry leaves. "They need stone." And then she looked away, her gaze fixed on something far beyond the dusty street, her audience with Ilara clearly over. The words made no sense, yet they settled in Ilara's mind, feeling less like a riddle and more like a blessing. The stone remembers. It was the second time she'd heard an idea like that. First from her father's ghost memory, now from this woman. Shaking her head, as if to clear it, Ilara climbed onto the wagon. She clucked to Gideon, and the old mule leaned into his harness. The wagon groaned and began to roll, leaving the town, its scorn, and its strange, cryptic prophecy behind. The road ahead led up. The journey to Whisperwind Ridge was a slow, arduous climb. The road, little more than a pair of rutted tracks, quickly left the fertile valley floor behind, winding its way up through sparse pine and juniper. The air grew thinner, cooler. The sounds of the town faded, replaced by the creak of the wagon wheels, the plodding rhythm of Gideon's hooves, and the rising voice of the wind. It was a constant, pressing thing, this wind. It streamed through the pines with a mournful sigh, tugged at the canvas cover of the wagon, and whipped loose strands of hair across Ilara's face. Henderson had been right. The wind never stopped. Gideon, patient as a saint, leaned into the incline, his breath coming in steady, white puffs. Ilara felt a deep kinship with the animal. They were two tired creatures, pulling a heavy load toward an uncertain destination. By late afternoon, they reached the turnoff described on the deed. It was barely a path, overgrown with sage and thistle. She had to get down twice to drag fallen branches out of the way. The wagon jolted and swayed over the uneven ground, and Ilara held the reins tight, her knuckles white. The ridge was higher than she'd thought, a spine of granite thrusting up toward the sky. The sun was beginning to dip toward the western mountains, casting long, distorted shadows that made the landscape feel alien and alive. Finally, through a stand of gnarled, wind-stunted pines, she saw it, the ruin. It was less a cabin and more a suggestion of one. 4 low, crumbling stone walls stood defiant against the sky, but the roof was entirely gone, its timbers having long ago collapsed inward to create a chaotic jumble of splintered wood and debris. The chimney stack, which she'd seen from the valley, stood tall at one end, a grim, solitary finger pointing at the heavens. There was no door, only a dark, gaping hole. The windows were empty eyes. The 16 acres of land were not a field, but a slope of rock and thin, pale soil, choked with weeds and thorny bushes. A single ancient oak tree grew near the ruin, its branches twisted and tormented into fantastic shapes by the relentless wind. Jedediah had not exaggerated. Blackwood had not lied. It was nothing. A wave of despair, cold and sharp, washed over Ilara. The anger that had fueled her climb from the town guttered and died, leaving only the hollow ache of a profound mistake. $50. She had spent her entire world on this pile of stones. The wind howled around the corners of the ruin, a sound of pure desolation. It was a place where things came to die, not to be reborn. She brought Gideon to a halt and slid wearily from the wagon seat. Her legs were stiff, her body sore. The mule lowered his head and stood motionless, as if he, too, were taking in the scale of their folly. Ilara walked slowly toward the cabin, her boots crunching on gravel and dried weeds. The air was sharp with the scent of pine and cold stone. She stopped at the threshold, the gaping hole that was once a doorway. Inside, the last of the day's light illuminated a scene of total decay. The floor was a mess of rotted wood, fallen stone, and dirt. Weeds grew up through the cracks. In the center of the room, the collapsed roof beams lay like the bones of some great, fallen beast. At the far end was the fireplace, a massive hearth of dark, soot-stained granite filled with rubble. It was worse than she could have imagined. This wasn't a home waiting for repair. It was a grave. The weight of her journey, her grief, and now this crushing disappointment pressed down on her. She leaned against the cold stone of the doorframe, the rough surface biting into her palm. Tears she had refused to shed in front of the town now burned behind her eyes. She had come here seeking refuge, a place to build. Instead, she had found the end of the line. The sun sank below the mountains, and the world was plunged into a deep purple twilight. The wind picked up, moaning through the empty windows. That night, she didn't even try to go inside. She unhitched Gideon, giving him his small ration of oats, and made her own cold camp in the lee of the wagon. She wrapped herself in her bedroll, listening to the lonely sounds of the ridge, the stones of her new home whispering of failure in the dark. That first night on the ridge was long and cold. Ilara slept fitfully, huddled in her bedroll, the constant sighing wind a restless companion. She woke before dawn, the sky a pale, bruised gray to the east. Every muscle ached. The despair of the previous evening had settled into a hard, dense knot in her stomach. For a long moment, she considered Blackwood's mocking offer. She could pack up, lead Gideon back down the mountain, and take his $5. She could swallow her pride and beg for work, for charity. The thought was so bitter, it was a physical taste in her mouth. She looked at the ruin, a dark silhouette against the growing light. It was hers. A failure, perhaps, but her failure. To turn back now would be to admit that Blackwood and the town were right, that she was nothing more than the broken widow they saw. With a resolve born of pure stubbornness, she rose. She built a small fire, boiled water for coffee, and ate a piece of dry bread. The simple ritual was grounding. Gideon watched her, his large, dark eyes patient. After she had eaten, she walked back to the cabin. In the clear, unforgiving light of morning, it looked even more hopeless. But today, she would not be defeated by the sight of it. Today, she would work. She had to start somewhere. The roof seemed impossible, the walls unstable. The floor was the only place to begin. She took her new axe, a pry bar, and a heavy pair of work gloves from the wagon. Her plan was simple. Clear the debris. Pull out the rotten timbers. Haul away the fallen stones. Get down to whatever was left of the original floor. It was brutal, punishing labor. The collapsed roof timbers were heavy and tangled, wedged together in a chaotic mess. She used the pry bar to lever them apart, the axe to chop through the most stubborn pieces. Splinters dug into her gloves. Her shoulders and back screamed in protest. She worked in a grim, methodical rhythm, dragging one piece of wood at a time out of the cabin and into a pile. By midday, she had cleared a small section near the door, revealing patches of the original flagstone floor underneath inches of dirt and rubble. She was sweat-soaked and covered in grime, but a small patch of solid ground was visible. It was the first victory, however small. She kept on, moving deeper into the single large room. Her focus narrowed to the task at hand. The next beam, the next pile of rubble. The world shrank to the space within those 4 stone walls. The town, her grief, her past. It all receded, replaced by the satisfying ache of physical exertion. As the afternoon wore on, she worked her way toward the great stone fireplace that dominated the far wall. It was choked with debris from the collapsed chimney and years of neglect. Soot and crumbled mortar covered everything. She began to haul out the larger pieces of fallen rock, tossing them onto a pile outside. Then she used a shovel to start clearing the smaller rubble and ash from the hearth itself. It was packed solid. As she dug, her shovel struck something that wasn't loose rock. It made a dull, clinking sound. Curious, she knelt down and began to clear the debris with her hands. Buried deep in the compacted ash and dirt at the very back of the hearth, nestled against the fireback, was a single, smooth stone. It was unlike the rough gray granite of the fireplace. This stone was dark, almost black. But when she turned it in the light, it shimmered with veins of an astonishing, deep blue-green, the color of a peacock's feather or a distant nebula. It was perfectly smooth, shaped like a large egg, and felt strangely dense and cool in her palm. It didn't belong here. The fireplace was made of local stone, quarried from the ridge. This was something else entirely, something foreign. She stood up, wiping the soot from the stone with her glove. It was beautiful, in a strange, quiet way, an anomaly. Why would it be here, tucked away in the back of a fireplace? Was it a good luck charm? A child's forgotten toy? A decorative piece left by the mysterious Mr. Macready? She had no answers. It was just a pretty rock. She was about to toss it onto the stone pile outside when she hesitated. Something about it felt special. It was the first beautiful thing she had found in this place of decay. On an impulse, she slipped it into the pocket of her dress. It felt heavy and solid against her leg, a small, secret discovery. She didn't understand it. She didn't know what it meant. But as she turned back to the half-cleared room, the ruin no longer seemed quite so hopeless. It now held a question, and a single, beautiful, out-of-place stone. Days turned into a week, and the week bled into a month. Ilara's life found a rhythm, dictated by the sun and the sheer scope of the work. Every morning she rose, tended to Gideon, and began her assault on the ruin. The pile of rotten timbers grew, a testament to her labor. She cleared the entire cabin floor, revealing a surprisingly intact flagstone foundation, scarred and stained but solid. Solid. The word echoed in her mind. After the floor was clear, she started on the walls, meticulously checking each stone. Using fresh mortar mixed with clay and water from a small, trickling spring she'd found a quarter-mile down the slope, to fill the gaps the wind had worried open over 30 years. Her hands, once soft, became calloused and strong. The sun browned her skin, and the constant work sculpted lean muscle onto her frame. She was no longer the frail widow who had arrived in the valley. She was becoming a part of the ridge, as weathered and resilient as the ancient pines. Gideon was her constant, silent shadow. The old mule would stand for hours in the shade of the twisted oak, watching her work, his ears occasionally flicking at a fly. His calm, patient presence was a balm. In the evenings, when she was too sore to move, she would sit with him, sharing a piece of an apple, her head resting against his warm, coarse flank. He would let out a low, rumbling sigh, a sound of deep contentment that seemed to say, "We are still here." He was her only friend, the only living creature who asked nothing of her and accepted her completely. Together, they were two solitary beings, holding their ground against a world that had discarded them. As she worked, she found more of the stones. They were not in the cabin walls or the foundation. They were in the earth itself. When she began the back-breaking task of clearing the 16 acres of weeds and thorny brush, her shovel would turn them up. They were never on the surface, always a foot or two down, nestled in the thin, rocky soil like sleeping things. Most were smaller than the first one she'd found, the size of a robin's egg or a thumb. But they all had the same strange density and the same mesmerizing blue-green veins. They were scattered randomly across the entire plot of land. At first she collected them, piling them neatly on the stone wall she was rebuilding. They were a curiosity, a small mystery. But as their numbers grew, so did her puzzlement. This wasn't a random scattering. There were too many of them. It felt intentional, like seeds sown in the ground. Remembering Alma's words, some roots don't need water, they need stone. Ilara began to pay closer attention to the plants growing near the strange stones. The land looked barren, choked with thistle and scrub. But where the blue-green stones were most numerous, she noticed a different kind of plant growing. It was a low, hardy herb with silvery green leaves and a tiny, deep purple flower. It didn't grow anywhere else on the ridge, only in the pockets of soil where the strange stones lay buried. When she crushed a leaf between her fingers, it released a sharp, clean scent, like mint and pine and something else, something medicinal. She didn't recognize it. It was another piece of the puzzle, another question without an answer. The stones and the herb seemed connected, a secret conversation happening in the soil beneath her feet. Her hands, through the simple act of clearing the land, were learning something her mind had not yet grasped. The work was no longer just about rebuilding a shelter. It was an investigation. Each shovelful of earth, each stone pulled from the wall, was a question posed to the silent, forgotten history of the place. And slowly, the land was beginning to offer up its clues. One afternoon, while repairing the flagstone floor near the hearth, her pry bar slipped between two stones and hit something that wasn't earth. It clanged with the hollow sound of metal. Her heart gave a small, quick beat. She worked the pry bar back into the gap and levered up one of the heavy flagstones. It came loose with a grating groan, releasing the scent of damp, trapped earth. Beneath it was a shallow cavity, and nestled inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had mostly rotted away, was a small tin box, rusted but intact. It was a document box, the kind a person might use to keep important papers safe from fire or flood. Her hands trembled slightly as she lifted it out. It was heavier than it looked. She carried it outside into the late afternoon light and sat on the low wall she had just finished rebuilding. Gideon, seeing the break in her routine, ambled over and nudged her shoulder with his soft nose. She pried the rusted lid open. Inside, preserved in the dry, sealed environment, was a leather-bound journal, a stack of letters tied with a faded ribbon, and several small, meticulously labeled paper packets. She picked up the journal first. The leather was stiff, the pages brittle. On the first page, in a neat, elegant script, was a name: Alistair Macready, botanist. Year of our Lord, 1851. Alistair Macready, the man her father had called a hermit who talked to plants. He was a botanist, a scientist. Ilara opened the journal and began to read. The world around her, the wind, the setting sun, the patient mule, faded away. She was transported back 30 years into the mind of the man who had built this place. He was not a hermit. He was a researcher. He had come to this valley not for gold or land, but for its unique geology. The journal was filled with detailed observations, sketches of rock formations, and complex chemical notations. He wrote of his search for a specific, rare mineral composite he called Petra caerulea, or the blue stone. He believed it held unique properties that could enrich soil in a way no other substance could. He had found it here, on this ridge. The blue-green stones, her stones. They were not just pretty rocks. According to Macready's notes, they were incredibly rich in copper, cobalt, and a dozen other trace minerals, a combination found nowhere else he had studied. He theorized that these minerals, when slowly released into the soil, could support plant life that would otherwise perish in such thin, arid ground. He wasn't just building a cabin, he was building a laboratory. This entire 16-acre plot was his experiment. Ilara's hands shook as she turned the pages. The journal then shifted from geology to botany. Macready had traveled the world collecting seeds of rare, hardy, and medicinal plants. Plants that thrived in the Andes, the Himalayas, the driest deserts. His goal was to see if they could be cultivated here, in the unique soil of his stone garden. She picked up one of the small paper packets. On it was written, Rhodiola crenulata, Tibetan highlands, resilient to frost and drought, a powerful adaptogen. Inside were tiny dark seeds. Another packet read, Salvia dori, Great Basin, purple sage, brewed for fevers and lung ailments. The silvery-leafed herb with the purple flower. It was growing all over her land. It wasn't a weed, it was a crop. Macready had succeeded. He had cultivated a garden of priceless, resilient medicinal herbs on this barren ridge. The letters told the final, sad part of the story. They were from his sister, begging him to come home. His funding from a distant university had run out, and his work was being dismissed as eccentric folly. The last letter was returned, marked deceased. He had died up here, alone, his work unfinished and unrecognized. Ilara looked up from the journal, her eyes blurred with tears. She looked at the rocky slope, the scattered patches of silver-leafed herbs, the pile of blue-green stones. It wasn't a ruin. It wasn't a folly. It was a legacy. A secret garden, waiting for someone patient enough to listen to the ground. She, a woman who had lost everything to the soil, had inherited a place where stones gave life. She looked at Gideon, and for the first time in a year, a genuine smile touched her lips. She knew what she had to do. The discovery changed everything. The work was no longer a fight against the land, but a partnership with it. Following the faded maps in Macready's journal, Ilara began to work with a new purpose. She wasn't just clearing land, she was tending a garden. She built low stone terraces to prevent erosion, just as his notes suggested. She carefully transplanted the wild purple sage, giving it room to breathe. She found the small, trickling spring he had documented and cleared a channel to direct its meager flow toward the most promising beds. Her days were still filled with hard labor, but now it was joyful, creative work. She felt the ghost of Alistair Macready at her side, a silent, encouraging presence. She was not just rebuilding his home, she was completing his life's work. Autumn arrived, painting the valley below in hues of gold and amber. On the ridge, the wind grew teeth. The nights were sharp with the coming frost. Ilara had managed to repair a section of the roof over one corner of the cabin, creating a small, dry space for her to sleep, her supplies, and Macready's precious journal. It wasn't much, but it was a home. She worked frantically, harvesting the seeds from the purple sage, drying the leaves, and storing them as the journal instructed. She was racing against the winter. One afternoon, the sky turned a strange, bruised yellow. The wind died down to an unnerving stillness. Gideon grew restless, pacing and sniffing the air, his ears flat against his head. Ilara had seen a sky like this once before. It meant a blizzard was coming, a bad one, and early. She scrambled to secure the cabin, banking the fire and bringing Gideon into the unfinished main room, sheltering him from the worst of what was to come. The snow began just after dusk, not as gentle flakes, but as a driving, horizontal wall of white. The wind returned with a vengeance, shrieking around the stone walls like a banshee. The storm was a physical assault, trying to tear her small sanctuary from the mountainside. Inside, huddled by the fire, Ilara listened to the fury, a profound sense of isolation settling over her. She was utterly alone, trapped on the ridge. Sometime deep in the night, over the roar of the wind, she heard a new sound, a desperate human shout. She grabbed her lantern and fought her way to the doorway, shielding the flame with her body. Through the blinding curtain of snow, she saw a faint, bobbing light far down the trail. Another shout, weaker this time. Someone was out there. Without a second thought for her own safety, she pulled on her heaviest coat, wrapped a rope around her waist, tied the other end to a support beam inside the cabin, and stepped out into the blizzard. The cold was shocking, a physical blow that stole her breath. The wind tore at her, and the snow blinded her. Following the faint cries, she fought her way down the path, the rope her only lifeline back to the cabin. She found them 100 yards down the slope. A family, a man, a woman, and 2 small children, huddled against the side of their broken wagon, one of its wheels shattered in a ditch. They were settlers, their clothes thin, their faces blue with cold. The man was trying to shield his family with his own body, but he was fading. "Help," he croaked, his voice barely a whisper. "I have shelter," Ilara yelled over the wind. "Come with me." With immense effort, she helped the man get his wife and children to their feet. The woman was coughing, a deep rattling sound in her chest, and the youngest child was frighteningly still. Leaning on each other, a small, desperate train of humanity, they followed Ilara's rope back through the screaming storm. Getting them into the cabin was a final, desperate struggle against the wind. Inside, the warmth of the fire was a shock. The family collapsed onto the floor, shivering uncontrollably. The woman, whose name was Sarah, was consumed by a feverish cough. Her breathing was shallow and ragged. Pneumonia, Ilara thought with a sinking heart. The town doctor was a day's ride away in good weather. In this storm, he might as well be on the moon. Panic threatened to overwhelm her. Then her eyes fell on the tin box, Macready's journal, Salvia dori, brewed for fevers and lung ailments. She went to her small store of dried herbs, the purple sage she had so carefully harvested. Her hands steady now, she followed the botanist's instructions, crushing the leaves and steeping them in hot water from the kettle on the fire. The scent, clean and sharp, filled the small room. She held the warm cup to Sarah's lips. "Drink this," she commanded gently. "It will help you breathe." The woman drank, her husband watching with helpless fear in his eyes. Ilara had chosen. She had committed not just to the cabin, not just to the garden, but to the knowledge that had been hidden here. In the heart of the storm, in her kingdom of rocks, she was sheltering strangers, fighting for a life with the forgotten wisdom of a ghost. The blizzard raged for 2 days and 2 nights, burying the ridge in a deep blanket of white. Inside the small, fire-lit corner of the cabin, Ilara tended to the stranded family. She brewed the purple sage tea for Sarah every few hours, the sharp, medicinal steam a constant presence in the air. She shared her meager stores of food, stew made from beans and dried vegetables, flatbread cooked on a hot stone by the fire. Slowly, miraculously, Sarah's fever began to recede. The rattling in her chest eased, and her breathing grew deeper, more regular. The children, wrapped in Ilara's spare blankets, regained their warmth and their spirit. The man, Thomas, watched Ilara with a look of quiet awe, his initial fear replaced by a profound, unspoken gratitude. He saw not a strange recluse, but a savior. He saw the strength in her hands, the calm in her eyes, the quiet competence with which she moved about her stone shelter. When the storm finally broke on the 3rd morning, the world was transformed. The sun shone on a landscape of pristine, silent white. The valley below was hidden under a sea of clouds. It was as if the ridge were an island in the sky. Thomas, his strength returned, helped Ilara dig a path out of the cabin. "We owe you our lives," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how we can ever repay you." "There's nothing to repay," Ilara said simply. "You were in need." It took another day for the snow to melt enough for travel to be safe. Thomas, a capable carpenter, spent the time helping Ilara brace the damaged roof timbers, his way of offering thanks. When it was time for them to leave, Sarah, now steady on her feet, embraced her. "That tea," she said, her hand on her chest. "It was like a miracle. What was it?" "An old remedy," Ilara replied, glancing toward the journal. "From the mountain." The family made their way down to Redemption Creek, leaving Ilara once more in the silence of her ridge, the quiet broken only by Gideon's soft chewing. The story they told in town, however, was anything but quiet. They spoke of a blizzard that nearly took them, a broken wagon, and the woman on Whisperwind Ridge who had saved them. They told of her stone cabin, a sanctuary in the storm, and of a miraculous herb that had cured a deadly lung fever. The townspeople, who had mocked Ilara for her folly, listened in stunned silence. The laughter died in their throats. A week later, a rider made his way up the winding path to the ridge. It was Dr. Adams, the town's physician, a thoughtful, educated man in his 50s. He found Ilara tending her terraced beds, clearing away the last of the snow. "Miss Vance," he said, dismounting, "I heard a remarkable story in town, about the Sawyer family." Ilara nodded, wiping her hands on her apron. "They were caught in the storm." "They said you treated Mrs. Sawyer's pneumonia with an herb," he said, his eyes full of professional curiosity. "May I ask what it was?" Instead of answering directly, Ilara invited him inside. She showed him the dried leaves of the purple sage. She showed him Macready's journal, the detailed notes, the careful sketches. Dr. Adams sat at her rough-hewn table for over an hour, turning the brittle pages with reverent hands. He read about the Petra Carolea, the blue stones, and the garden of resilient medicinal plants. He looked at the samples Ilara had collected, his initial skepticism melting into sheer astonishment. "My God," he murmured, looking up at her, his expression one of deep respect. This is the work of a genius. Alistair Macready. I've read his early papers. He was dismissed as a crank, but he was right." He looked around the cabin, at the neatly stacked herbs, the organized seed packets. "And you, Miss Vance, you've brought it all back to life." He confirmed everything she had come to believe. The purple sage was a known, if rare, anti-inflammatory. The Tibetan rhodiola was a legendary tonic for strength and resilience. The other plants described in the journal were a veritable pharmacopoeia, a treasure trove of remedies perfectly suited for a remote community. The barren plot of land was one of the most valuable gardens he had ever seen. Word of the doctor's visit and his validation spread through the valley like wildfire. The narrative had shifted. The widow's folly was no longer a joke. It was a place of wonder. People began to look up at the ridge not with scorn, but with a new reverence. Even Silas Blackwood was silenced. That winter was hard, and a blight swept through the cattle herds in the lowlands. His own prize-winning bull fell ill. Humbled, he sent a ranch hand up the mountain with a silent request for help. Ilara, without a word of triumph, sent back a poultice made from another of Macready's herbs, just as the journal described. The bull recovered. Blackwood never laughed at her again. The following spring, the ridge came alive. Under Ilara's careful stewardship, the garden flourished. The silvery purple sage grew in thick, fragrant rows on the stone terraces. The Tibetan rhodiola sent up tough, succulent shoots. Dozens of other plants, whose names she now knew by heart, bloomed in a riot of quiet, hardy color. The air was thick with the scent of herbs and damp earth. Dr. Adams became a regular visitor, bringing supplies and taking away carefully measured harvests of herbs to create tonics and remedies for the town. Redemption Creek, once so isolated, now had its own apothecary, thanks to the woman they had scorned. People from neighboring valleys began to make the journey, seeking out the healing plants from Whisperwind Ridge. The path to her cabin, once overgrown and forgotten, became a well-worn trail. Ilara hired Thomas Sawyer to help her finish the cabin. With his skill and her vision, they transformed the ruin into a sturdy, beautiful home. They rebuilt the roof with strong timbers, installed glass in the windows, and hung a solid oak door. The great stone hearth, once a symbol of decay, now radiated warmth and life. The cabin was no longer a shelter, it was a home, and the center of a thriving enterprise. The town that had once pitied her now depended on her. They saw her not as the failed widow, but as the quiet, determined woman who had listened to the land when no one else would. They called her the healer of Whisperwind Ridge. The name Widow's Folly was forgotten, erased from the valley's memory and replaced by a story of resilience and discovery. One evening, as the sun dipped low, casting the world in a warm, golden light, Ilara stood on the edge of her highest terrace. Below her, the valley was peaceful, bathed in the soft glow of dusk. Gideon stood beside her, his warm breath fogging in the cool air. The silence was no longer one of loneliness, but of deep, abiding peace. Dr. Adams was with her, finalizing a large order that would supply clinics 2 counties away. He looked out over the thriving, terraced gardens, a testament to her tireless work. "You've built something remarkable here, Ilara," he said quietly. "More than Macready himself ever managed. What do you call this place now?" Ilara looked at the blue-green stones that edged the garden beds, shimmering in the last light. She looked at the tough, beautiful plants growing from the rocky soil. She thought of the whispers and the scorn, of the cold despair of her first night, and of the quiet joy of discovery. She placed a hand on Gideon's strong neck, feeling the steady, living warmth of him. I didn't build a garden, she said, her voice soft but clear, carrying the entire weight of her journey. I just learned to listen to the ground. Thank you for staying with us to the very end of this journey. It's a powerful reminder that true value is often hidden right beneath our feet, waiting for a patient hand and a quiet heart. If you were moved by Alara's story of resilience, please give this video a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe for more tales of forgotten history brought back to the light. We'll see you next time.